So the day this video is posted, which is like January 19, 2021, it has been exactly 10 years since I've had my hysterectomy. This 10-year anniversary seemed like a good opportunity for me to take a little trip down memory lane and reminisce a little bit. This video will most likely be a collection of eclectic and maybe incoherent memories, anecdotes, and, just looking back on them and explaining how I feel about them now. I don't think this video will be very helpful for others because it's a highly specific case. Like, I doubt many others will find themselves in the exact same boat. Also, it has been so long that I don't remember many of the details, so it won't be a very complete recollection of, my recovery after the surgery or anything. Making this video feels very therapeutic to me, so that's enough reason for me to be making it. For those of you who don't know, a hysterectomy is a surgical procedure in which the uterus or womb, but sometimes also the cervix, fallopian tubes, ovaries, are removed from a person's body. In my case, they took out the uterus and the cervix because I didn't really have any ovaries that they could take out, and I'm not really sure if I had proper fallopian tubes or not. This procedure can be performed in a variety of ways, vaginally, through an incision in the abdomen. I'm no doctor, I don't know all the details, I'm not gonna explain them here either. All I know is that in my case, they did it abdominally because I hadn't gone through childbirth yet and my vagina was too narrow, too small to pull the uterus through. If they perform a hysterectomy abdominally, then that means you have a pretty big scar. Mine is 13 centimeters or a little over 5 inches. In the beginning, it was very sore and red and itchy, like that remained for a couple of years. But now all of that has subsided. It's just become skin color and it just is a little line. The scar runs horizontally between my two hips and it's situated right above my pubic hair. I must say the doctor did a pretty good job stitching me up. She used this technique where the sutures are underneath your skin, basically, and the stitches, like the material, like just disintegrates by itself, so they didn't need to be removed or anything, which was very nice. So the name hysterectomy refers to the removal of hysteria. Back in the olden days, people, mostly men, thought that the uncontrollable, overly emotional, dysfunctional, insane behavior of some women was caused by their uteruses or their hormones. Hysterical, a word with negative connotation, still to this day often used to refer to women, comes from the Latin hystericus, which literally means of the womb. By removing the uterus, they were hoping to cure this hysteria. Needless to say, they didn't find this procedure very helpful for these symptoms. Can confirm I'm still as hysterical as I was before my surgery. So some of you now may be wondering why I needed this procedure done at the young age of 17 and a half, which is a fair question. When I was 14 or 15, I was diagnosed with Turner syndrome. This diagnosis came on top of 2 other chronic illnesses that I already had that I was also born with. Turner syndrome basically means I only have 1 X chromosome instead of 2. I mean, technically I have an X chromosome and a half because I have the mosaic variant, but that doesn't really matter right now. Back in those days, I was given a lot of hormones to help my puberty along and help me grow because I was and am very short. Because of those hormones, my uterus started growing a lot, started expanding, and I started getting breakthrough bleeds, which basically means that even though my hormone levels were stable, they were constant because I was taking the same dosage every day, my uterus still decided to shed its lovely red lining. Yay! Those breakthrough bleeds, or my periods, were always very heavy and very painful. There would be a lot of cramping involved. Sometimes I would have to get up several times a night to change my bed linen because I had tainted everything red. Yay! Back then I was also using the biggest tampons we could find, like specially meant for women with a heavy flow. And sometimes I would leak through them after like half an hour, which was pretty insane. I remember going to the gynecologist for the first time. I must have looked very young and frail and short, and based on that, she assumed that I wasn't having my period yet. So she asked my mom and I if that was the case. My mom and I were both like, you sweet, sweet summer child. So my mom and I explained everything, and like about the hormone treatments, about the heavy breakthrough bleeds, about, everything. And she wrote it all down in a file and everything was fine. Then we moved on to the more physical part of the appointment. The gynecologist performed an internal sonogram. Not very comfortable, but, necessary. My mom jokingly said to her, like, she's afraid that everything will have to be taken out. Everything meaning uterus, etc., etc. When my mom said that, the gynecologist, like, turned white as a ghost. Like, any blood left in her face just suddenly drained, and she became dead serious instantly. The doctor then explained to us that that would eventually definitely be the better option, given my situation, given the circumstances. So what happened was that the doctor didn't really have the guts to bring up the surgery herself. Like, she wanted to try other hormone treatments first and like ease me into the idea of maybe someday having this surgery. But from that first consultation onwards, both my parents and I were pretty much okay with the idea of having the surgery. It wasn't my favorite prospect, like it was, a pretty big blow, but I realized that it would be the best option for me and my body in the long run. So yeah, it wasn't a very difficult decision to make. After the surgery, it was definitely confirmed to have been the better option. The doctor decided to send my uterus to a lab for, analysis. They found that the uterine lining, so the period blood basically, wasn't just building up in the uterus itself, but also in the uterine wall. So literally in the organ itself, in the muscle of the uterus itself, which explains the very heavy cramping, because my uterus was apparently trying to expel that lining as well, but it couldn't because it was stuck inside the walls of the uterus. This condition can apparently eventually cause adhesions and like a whole array of other medical problems. So that really did confirm that we did it at the right time before there were any other complications. So would I do it again? Would I decide to go through the surgery again? Definitely. In a heartbeat. Does it suck that it needed to happen? Yeah, it does. Very much so. Leading up to the surgery, I was obviously very nervous, and I remember not sleeping very well the days beforehand and not really being able to focus on things, and it really preoccupied my mind. Then the day of the surgery, my parents and I went to the hospital. We went to the maternity ward because apparently when you get a hysterectomy, you're usually put on the maternity ward. Yay! And I remember having to get undressed for the nurse to shave me intimately while my parents were present. Not a fun moment for a 17-and-a-half-year-old to get naked in front of their parents. While the nurse was shaving me, I remember looking to my left and seeing one of those little plastic cribs, like those little plastic cots that they put newborns in. Because apparently they'd forgotten to take that out while they were prepping the room for me. Yay! I have to say, being brought to the OR that day, being put to sleep, was probably one of the best experiences that I've had being put to sleep for any surgery ever. The people in the OR were also nice to me. They were so nurturing and caring. I remember one nurse like rubbing my cheek gently and telling me that it was all going to be okay and that they were going to take good care of me. And I often still tear up when I remember those moments right before the surgery. I don't remember much of the recovery room, like the room that you wake up in after a surgery. But what I do remember is blackness, obviously, and a vague thought of my tummy area really hurting. But like, oh my god, what is this kind of pain hurting? And also the sensation of some warm liquid flowing from my mouth, which may seem like a very odd memory to have, but it's not as odd if you know that apparently I puked in recovery. Yeah, I'm kind of glad I don't really fully remember that. Then when I was fully and properly awake again, I got brought back to my room, and I was very grateful then for being hard of hearing, because I couldn't hear any crying. My parents obviously did hear all the crying, and they were free to come and go as they pleased. You know, they could go get a cup of coffee at the cafeteria or whatever. So they had to walk past all the other rooms with the new parents and the newborns and the new grandparents, and they were all raising their glasses to their new bundle of joy that they just brought into the world. Yeah, that must not have been fun for my parents. I remember not long after I got back to the room, they had to turn me on my side for something. I think it was to put some sort of protective cloth underneath me in case the bladder probe would leak or whatever, to keep the bed more clean. But I remember that was so painful, like, oh. And I was crying and whimpering, and I could not keep quiet. It was just too much. Luckily, those first days, or the first day after the surgery, I had this nifty button next to my shoulder. It was like hooked up to an IV. And if I was in pain, I could press it, and then it would administer some sort of painkiller or sedative-ish type of medication, which was nice because then I would not be in so much pain. But it did also really frustrate me that I would always fall back asleep. I wanted to be awake, you know, I wanted to talk to people, I wanted to watch TV, but I couldn't, so I basically just slept. Throughout the years, I've gotten a lot of odd and sometimes hurtful comments with regards to my hysterectomy, and I thought it would be a good idea to go over some of them here. Back then, I didn't really have the most supportive classmates. They didn't really understand where I came from. They didn't really understand my whole medical deal, and they just thought it was weird. So I was excluded a little bit. The day after my first appointment at the gynecologist, where we decided that I would be getting the hysterectomy, we had this little field trip to like the courtroom here in the city. The field trip was only half a day, you know, it was only during the morning hours. And since I'd slept terribly and I was very emotional and I felt very vulnerable, my mom allowed me to sleep in and only go to my afternoon classes. When I arrived in class that afternoon, my classmates were obviously interrogating me, like, where were you? Why didn't you come? Because I didn't really feel like talking about it. I just said, like, yeah, I had some bad news and I had a really rough night, so, you know, figured I would miss the field trip and come to these classes. And then they kept interrogating me. They were like, oh, yeah, what news is so bad that you get to miss a field trip? Like, what news is so bad that you get to miss school? If that's the case, you know, I wouldn't mind getting some bad news myself, eh? Thanks. And then I just sort of blurted it out, you know, like, yeah, I'm gonna have my uterus removed. And the class basically went quiet, and my teacher came up to me and she asked me if she heard right, because it's not a very common thing to hear one of your students say, I'm sure. And I confirmed that she did indeed, you know, hear right. And she was like, yeah, that is some really tough news. And then another time when I was absent for a couple of days, like, I don't remember why, I came back to school and my classmates were like, ah, is it over? Have you had your surgery? I was like, no. I wouldn't be back at school after 4 days if I had the surgery, would I? Anyway, my classmates were young. They didn't really get it, and I'm sure they meant no harm, but it made school pretty tough sometimes. Some of my family members also didn't really know how to respond to this news, you know? So my grandma once told me, I also had to have everything removed. It's okay. It'll be fine. Grandma, I love you. I know you love me, but you were 40 and you had 5 kids. It's not really the same now, is it? Around the time of my surgery, another family member told me that she didn't want kids herself either. Sure, But you're 18. You have the option to. You can still change your mind. I can't. And again, I know these comments were meant very well. I know my family loves me. You know, that's not the issue here. I'm just saying those are maybe not the best things to say to a 17-and-a-half-year-old going through this surgery. I've noticed that throughout the years, people often refer to the timing. Oh, you're still so young. You don't need to think or worry about having kids yet, you know. Okay, fine. I guess I'll wait. Now I'm at this point in my life where I probably would be having kids if I could. People tell me like, oh, it's been so long. Have you still not accepted that? You should have processed that by now, you know? Thanks. Very helpful. When was I supposed to grieve? When was the appropriate time for me to grieve? Even if this loss was very symbolic. The most hurtful comment I've gotten with regards to this surgery came from a doctor, however. This doctor works for a government organization which assesses disabilities. So people with a disability basically have to come to their office and prove that they actually have a disability and that they're entitled to some sort of support. When I was telling this doctor about the surgery and the emotional toll that it still has on me, he was like, that surgery didn't matter. You didn't have ovaries, so you couldn't have kids anyway. Dude, really? Are we really going to minimize the symbolic significance of this surgery? Especially with a 17-and-a-half-year-old? Believe me, that is not the only kind of hurtful comment that I've gotten from that doctor or doctors like him. I'll definitely make a video about them someday. Looking back on everything now, 10 years later, and hopefully also 10 years wiser, there are a couple of pieces of advice that I would like to give my 17-and-a-half-year-old self. Number 1, don't worry so much about the physical recovery. Sure, you'll be in pain, there will be discomfort, but it'll basically be over before you know it. The physical recovery is a lot faster than you expected it to be. Number 2, don't ignore the emotional recovery. Even though with or without the surgery you couldn't have kids anyway, the surgery is still very symbolic for your infertility, and it's okay to actively process that, to think about that, to grieve about that. Number 3, don't worry about the bladder probe. That thing was honestly the least of your concerns after having your abdomen cut open. Number 4, you had to stay home from school for 6 weeks after your surgery, and I know it felt like that time would not end, but like in a good way. I know you wanted it to last longer. You were almost excited about it because school back then was not a good place for you. And I just want to say that it'll get better. It might take 10 years, but you'll get there. Have you had any life-changing surgeries in your life? How did you cope? What are some of the silly or weird or hurtful comments that you've gotten with regards to your surgery? Let me know in the comments.